Now let's begin. Grant Reeves had learned to read the warning signs in his wife's voice, the slight edge that crept in when her mother called, the careful neutrality that replaced warmth. This Tuesday evening was no different. Melinda stood in their kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gripping the counter with white knuckles. "Yes, Mother. I understand." A pause. "No, that's not what I said." Another pause, longer. "Fine. Tomorrow works." Grant looked up from where he sat helping their 7-year-old daughter, Emma, with her math homework at the dining table. Emma's pencil had stilled, her dark eyes watching her mother with that unsettling perceptiveness children develop in households with tension threading through the walls. Melinda ended the call and turned, forcing brightness into her expression. "Mom's coming by tomorrow after work. She made cookies for Emma." "The snickerdoodles?" Emma's face lit up, and Grant felt his chest tighten. His daughter shouldn't have to be this excited about something as simple as cookies from her grandmother. But Gertrude Murphy had a way of making her affection feel earned rather than given, doling out warmth like rations. "Something special," she said. Melinda's smile didn't reach her eyes. "She's been baking all week." Grant had been married to Melinda for 9 years, together for 12, and in all that time, he'd never quite managed to crack the code of his mother-in-law. Gertrude Murphy was a formidable woman, 63 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of steel-spined presence that made people instinctively straighten their posture. She'd raised Melinda alone after her husband Jeffrey passed when Melinda was 16, building a small real estate empire in the process. She was respected, successful, and had made it clear from day one that Grant, a civil engineer from a middle-class family in Ohio, was not the man she'd envisioned for her only daughter. "That's nice of her," Grant said carefully, returning to Emma's homework. "You're almost done here, sweetheart. Just 2 more problems." Later that night, after Emma was asleep, Grant found Melinda staring out their bedroom window at the Chicago skyline. They lived in a modest 3-bedroom condo in Lincoln Park, modest by Gertrude's standards, anyway. The older woman had offered to buy them something more suitable in Gold Coast, an offer Grant had politely declined. He'd worked hard for what they had, and he wasn't about to let Gertrude Murphy buy her way into more control over their lives. She asked about Emma's school again. Melinda said quietly, "Suggested we consider Brightwood Academy." Grant's jaw tightened. Brightwood was the prestigious private school where Gertrude sat on the board. "Emma's happy at Lincoln Elementary." "I know." Melinda turned to face him, and in the dim light, he could see the exhaustion in her features. His wife was beautiful, sharp cheekbones, auburn hair, green eyes that had first caught his attention at a mutual friend's barbecue. But lately, she looked worn down. "I told her that. And she said we're limiting Emma's potential. That with her connections, Emma could have opportunities we're denying her." Melinda's voice cracked slightly. "Sometimes I wonder if she's right." Grant crossed the room and pulled his wife into his arms. "Emma doesn't need Gertrude's connections. She needs parents who love her and let her be a kid. Not some mini-adult being groomed for your mother's version of success." Melinda nodded against his chest, but Grant could feel the doubt still coiled inside her. That was Gertrude's particular talent, planting seeds of uncertainty, making you question decisions you'd been confident about moments before. The next evening, Gertrude arrived at 6:30 sharp, as punctual as always. She swept into their home wearing a tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair in its signature French twist, carrying an expensive leather handbag and a ceramic cookie jar shaped like a cheerful bear. "Grandmother." Emma rushed to hug her, and Gertrude's entire demeanor softened in a way Grant had rarely witnessed. Whatever else was true about the woman, she seemed to genuinely love her granddaughter. "Hello, darling girl." Gertrude bent to kiss Emma's forehead, then straightened and fixed Grant with her cool, assessing gaze. "Grant." "Gertrude. Thanks for coming by. I wouldn't miss seeing Emma." She set the cookie jar on the kitchen counter with a decisive thunk. "I spent 3 days perfecting these. A new recipe, Belgian butter cookies with a special vanilla bean I had imported." Grant watched as she lifted the lid. Inside were perfectly uniform cookies, each one golden brown and dusted with what looked like powdered sugar. They smelled incredible, rich with butter and vanilla. "Can I have one now?" Emma bounced on her toes. After dinner, Melinda interjected gently. "Why don't you go wash your hands? Dinner's almost ready." As Emma scampered off, Gertrude turned to Melinda. "I wanted to discuss something with you both." Jeffrey's sister Maxine called. She's putting together a trust fund for Emma, college, future expenses. But there are some paperwork requirements. Grant's antenna went up immediately. What kind of requirements? Gertrude's lips pursed slightly, as if his question was mildly offensive. Nothing invasive. Just documentation establishing Emma's legal guardianship arrangements. In case anything were to happen to you both. We already have that covered in our will, Grant said. My brother Lee is Emma's designated guardian. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lee? The one who lives in that trailer park in Ohio. It's a mobile home community, and he's a good man with a stable job. Stable? He works at a factory. Gertrude's voice dripped with disdain. Emma deserves better than being raised by someone who peaked at assembly line work. That's enough. Grant's voice was quiet but firm. Lee is my brother, and he's a good person. Better than a lot of people with bigger bank accounts. Melinda stepped between them, her peacemaker role so practiced it looked like choreography. Mom, let's not do this. Dinner's ready. Can we just have a nice evening? Gertrude smoothed her jacket, her composure sliding back into place. Of course. I apologize. I only want what's best for Emma. Dinner was a tense affair, conversation carefully steered toward neutral topics. Emma's upcoming field trip, a new restaurant Gertrude had tried, Grant's latest project designing a sustainable housing development. But underneath it all, Grant could feel the undercurrent of Gertrude's disapproval, her subtle undermining. She complimented Melinda's cooking with a mention of how she herself used fresh herbs from her rooftop garden. She praised Emma's report card while suggesting additional tutoring in mathematics. Each comment had a barb hidden in velvet. After Gertrude left, departing without the cookie jar, insisting Emma should enjoy them all, Grant helped Melinda clean up while Emma watched cartoons. I'm taking the cookies to work tomorrow, Grant said. Share them with the team. We've been pulling long hours on the Riverside project. Melinda looked up from loading the dishwasher, surprised. Mom made them for Emma. And Emma can have some. But that's too many cookies for a 7-year-old. He glanced at the jar. Besides, it might smooth things over with your mother if I make a point of enjoying her baking. It was a peace offering in his own way, and Melinda recognized it. She smiled slightly. That's actually thoughtful. I have my moments. The next morning, Grant packed the cookie jar carefully in his messenger bag alongside his laptop and project files. His firm, Morrison & Associates, was a mid-sized civil engineering company with offices in a renovated warehouse in the West Loop. Grant specialized in sustainable urban development, and lately, he'd been consumed by the Riverside project, a mixed-use development that would transform an abandoned industrial site into affordable housing and community spaces. His team of 6 engineers and designers had been working overtime, and Grant had developed a reputation as a fair but demanding project lead. He'd built his career on competence and integrity, refusing to cut corners or compromise on safety standards even when clients pushed back. It had cost him some contracts over the years, but he slept well at night. The morning was consumed by meetings, conference calls with contractors, budget reviews, permit discussions. It wasn't until nearly noon that Grant remembered the cookies. He was in the break room, about to open the jar, when his phone rang. Grant, we need you in Conference B, his boss, Clark Chung, said. The Riverside investors are here early. Grant cursed under his breath, set the cookie jar on the counter, and hurried out. The meeting ran long. Investors always had more questions than time allotted, and by the time Grant emerged, it was past 1. He grabbed the cookie jar and headed back to his office, intending to finally distribute the cookies and grab lunch. But as he rounded the corner near the elevators, he collided with someone. The cookie jar flew from his hands, hit the tile floor, and shattered. Damn it! Grant dropped to his knees, staring at the scattered cookies and broken ceramic. The cheerful bear's head had split clean off. I'm so sorry, man. Ismail Collins, one of the pharmaceutical researchers from the biotech firm that shared their building, crouched down beside him. I wasn't watching where I was going. No, it's my fault. I was distracted. Grant started gathering the larger pieces of ceramic, careful of the sharp edges. Ismail picked up one of the cookies, examining it. These look amazing. Homemade. My mother-in-law made them. I was going to share them with the team. Grant sighed. Most of them look okay, at least. The jar's the only casualty. But Ismail wasn't responding. Grant looked up and saw his friend's expression had changed. Ismael was holding the cookie close to his face, turning it slowly, and his brown skin had taken on a grayish cast. Ismael. Grant. Where did you say these came from? My mother-in-law. What? Ismael stood abruptly, still holding the cookie. Come with me. Right now. What? I need to clean this up. Leave it. Ismael's voice was sharp with urgency. This is important. Do you have more of these at home? Yeah, my daughter was supposed to. Why? What's wrong? Ismael was already walking rapidly toward the elevators, Grant hurrying after him. They rode down to the third floor, where Ismael's pharmaceutical research lab occupied a corner suite. Ismael badged them through security, led Grant to his personal lab, and placed the cookie under a microscope. After a moment, Ismael pulled back, his hands shaking slightly. He moved to a chemical analysis station, broke off a small piece of the cookie, and began running tests Grant didn't fully understand. 5 minutes passed in tense silence. Then Ismael's computer beeped. He stared at the screen, and Grant watched all the color drain from his friend's face. These aren't cookies, Ismael said quietly. I mean, they are, but... He turned to Grant, and there was fear in his eyes. Grant, there's arsenic in these. A lot of it. Enough to make someone very sick. Possibly kill a child. The room tilted. Grant grabbed the edge of the lab table to steady himself. That's impossible, he heard himself say. Gertrude made these for Emma. She loves Emma. I'm calling 911. Ismael already had his phone out. And you need to call your wife. Right now? If your daughter ate any of these. Grant's hands were numb as he pulled out his phone. The call to Melinda went straight to voicemail. She'd be in her weekly department meeting at the marketing firm where she worked. He tried their home phone. No answer. Melinda's not picking up. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. Emma's at school. She's at school. She didn't have any this morning. Are you sure? Grant's mind raced back. This morning, Emma had been running late. He'd made her toast and packed her lunch while Melinda dried her hair. Neither of them had mentioned cookies. The jar had been sitting on the counter where he'd left it the night before. I'm sure. She didn't have any. Ismael was talking to the 911 operator, explaining the situation. Grant heard him say arsenic poisoning and child in danger, and police need to be notified. They're sending officers to the building and to your home, Ismael said after hanging up. They want you to go to the hospital with your daughter immediately. They're also sending someone to her school to make sure she doesn't consume anything your mother-in-law might have given her. Grant's shock was crystallizing into something else, a cold, focused fury. He pulled out his phone again and called Lincoln Elementary. The secretary answered on the second ring. This is Grant Reeves, Emma Reeves' father. I need to speak to her teacher immediately. It's an emergency. Minutes later, he had confirmation. Emma hadn't eaten anything unusual. She'd had the lunch Grant packed, and she'd mentioned to her teacher that her grandmother had brought cookies, but she hadn't brought any to school. But Grant, Emma's teacher, Joy Buchanan, said carefully, Emma did say something odd. She said her grandmother told her to make sure she ate at least 3 cookies every day, and that it was their special secret. A special secret. Grant's hand clenched around his phone so hard, he heard the case crack. The police arrived within 15 minutes. 2 detectives, a man and a woman, both wearing expressions of grim professionalism. Ismael had bagged the cookie he'd tested along with several others from the scattered pile, documenting everything with photos. Mr. Reeves, I'm Detective Carol Fletcher, and this is Detective Orlando House, the woman said. She was in her 40s, with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. We need to ask you some questions about your mother-in-law. Grant told them everything he could think of, Gertrude's name, address, her relationship with Emma, the tension in their family, last night's visit. He tried to be objective, but rage kept bleeding through his words. Has Mrs. Murphy ever threatened your daughter? Detective House asked. He was younger, maybe early 30s, with the kind of alertness that suggested he didn't miss much. No, never. She seemed to love Emma. She's controlling, manipulative, but I never thought. Grant couldn't finish the sentence. What about life insurance? Any financial motive? Emma has a small policy, but I'm the beneficiary, not Gertrude. There's no money motive that I know of. Detective Fletcher exchanged a look with her partner. Mr. Reeves, I need you to be honest with me. Is your marriage stable? The question hit Grant like a slap. What does that have to do with anything? Just answer the question, please. It's stable. We have the usual stress, money, work, dealing with Gertrude's interference, but we're solid. Why? Because sometimes grandparents act to rescue a grandchild from a situation they perceive as harmful. If your mother-in-law disapproved of you strongly enough, the implications settled over Grant like ice water. Gertrude hadn't been trying to kill Emma. She'd been trying to make Emma sick enough to remove her from Grant and Melinda's custody. She wants Emma, he said slowly. She's been pushing for guardianship arrangements, criticizing our parenting, our choices. Detective Fletcher nodded grimly. We've seen cases like this before. Not common, but not unheard of. Usually involves grandparents who believe they can provide a better life. I need to get to my daughter. Now. Officers are already at her school. She's safe. But yes, take her to Chicago Memorial for a full toxicology screening. We're getting a warrant for your mother-in-law's residence and any communications between her and your wife. Melinda doesn't know anything about this, Grant said sharply. We'll determine that. Right now, don't contact Mrs. Murphy. Don't warn her. We need to catch her with evidence, the recipe, the arsenic source, anything that proves intent. Grant drove to Lincoln Elementary in a daze, his mind churning. He kept seeing Emma's face light up when Gertrude had walked in with that cookie jar. Kept hearing his daughter say it was their special secret. Emma was waiting in the principal's office with Ms. Buchanan and 2 uniformed officers. When she saw Grant, she ran to him, and he scooped her up, holding her tight enough to make her squeak. Daddy, why are the police here? Did something bad happen? Grant pulled back and looked at his daughter, her dark hair in pigtails, her small face worried but not scared. She trusted him to make things right. She always had. We're going to the hospital, sweetheart, just to make sure you're healthy. But I feel fine. I know, but we need to check something. Did you eat any of grandmother's cookies? Emma shook her head. I wanted to this morning, but you said after school, and I was going to have one when I got home. Thank God. Thank God for rushed mornings and his own forgetfulness. At Chicago Memorial, they were taken immediately to a private examination room. A doctor named Brenda Stevens, a calm woman in her 50s, explained they'd be running blood tests and a full toxicology panel. What are we looking for? Emma asked, her child's directness cutting through adult euphemisms. Dr. Stevens glanced at Grant, who nodded. His daughter deserved honesty. We're checking to make sure nothing bad was in the cookies your grandmother made. Emma's eyes widened. Like poison. Like something that could make you sick, yes. To Grant's surprise, Emma didn't cry. She just processed this information with solemn seriousness and held out her arm for the blood draw. While they waited for results, Melinda arrived, ashen-faced and shaking. She'd gotten Grant's messages and the police notification simultaneously. How could she? Melinda kept repeating. How could she do this? But underneath the shock, Grant could see something else taking root in his wife's expression, guilt. Because part of Melinda had always known her mother was capable of extreme actions. She'd just never imagined they'd be directed at Emma. The toxicology results came back an hour later. Emma's blood was clean. She'd never ingested the arsenic. But Dr. Stevens's expression was grave as she delivered the follow-up news. The police asked me to inform you. They found the same arsenic compound in a bottle of vanilla extract at your mother-in-law's home. The compound is typically used in industrial applications, specifically in wood preservatives. Mrs. Murphy worked in real estate development before retiring. She would have had access. Melinda made a small, wounded sound. Grant put his arm around her shoulders. There's more, Dr. Stevens continued. Detectives found email communications between Mrs. Murphy and an attorney discussing emergency custody petitions. She'd been planning this for months. The final piece clicked into place. Gertrude hadn't snapped or acted impulsively. This had been calculated, methodical. She'd been trying to make Emma chronically ill, sick enough to justify removing her from their home, but not sick enough to be immediately fatal. A slow poisoning that would be attributed to neglect or environmental factors until Gertrude could swoop in as the concerned grandmother seeking custody. Grant felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. The police would handle the legal aspects. Gertrude would be arrested, charged, prosecuted. But that wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. His daughter had been targeted by someone who was supposed to love her. His wife was destroyed by her mother's betrayal. And Grant Reeves was going to make absolutely certain that Gertrude Murphy paid for what she'd tried to do. Not just through the legal system, but in ways that would strip away everything she valued, her reputation, her standing in the community, her carefully constructed image of the devoted grandmother and successful businesswoman. Grant had always played by the rules, taken the high road, been the better person. But Gertrude had broken something fundamental when she put arsenic in those cookies. And Grant was going to show her exactly what happened when you came after his family. The arrest happened fast. Within hours of the hospital visit, Gertrude Murphy was taken into custody at her penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. Grant wasn't there. The police had advised him to stay away, but Melinda's cousin Tabitha Duke called with updates, her voice hushed and shocked. They found everything, Tabitha said. The arsenic compound, the recipe with dosage notes in the margins, emails to that lawyer about custody procedures. She'd been documenting Emma's school records, your finances, everything. Building a case that you two were unfit parents. Grant sat in their darkened living room, Emma finally asleep in her bed after hours of reassurances that she was safe. Melinda was in their bedroom, alternating between crying and staring at nothing. The woman Grant had married seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger. There's something else, Tabitha continued. The police found a journal. Gertrude had been planning this since Emma was born. She wrote about how you weren't good enough, how Melinda made a mistake marrying you, how Emma needed to be saved from a mediocre life. Grant's grip tightened on his phone. She wrote this down? In detail, like she was proud of it, like she was the hero of her own story. Tabitha's voice cracked. I knew Aunt Gertrude could be difficult, but she's sick, Grant. She needs help. After hanging up, Grant sat in the darkness for a long time. His engineer's mind, trained to solve problems systematically, was already working through angles and possibilities. The legal process would unfold: arraignment, bail hearing, trial. With the evidence the police had, conviction seemed certain. Gertrude would go to prison. But Grant knew the reality of the justice system. She was 63, a first-time offender from a wealthy family, with no prior record. Her lawyers, and she'd hire the best, would argue diminished capacity, mental illness, grandmotherly concern gone tragically wrong. She might serve 5 years. Maybe 10 if they were lucky. That wasn't justice. Not for what she'd tried to do. Grant pulled out his laptop and started researching. He'd never been the vengeful type, never understood people who dedicated themselves to payback. But he was discovering new depths in himself, a capacity for cold, calculated fury that felt both foreign and entirely natural. Over the next few days, while Melinda struggled to function and Emma asked questions no 7-year-old should have to ask, Grant dug into Gertrude's life with the same meticulous attention he applied to structural calculations. Gertrude Murphy had built her real estate empire through a combination of shrewd investing and ruthless business practices. She'd started with the inheritance from her late husband Jeffrey, a substantial sum from his family's manufacturing business, and parlayed it into ownership of 12 commercial properties across Chicago. She sat on boards, chaired charity committees, and had her name on a wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Her reputation was everything to her. Grant had seen it in the way she controlled conversations at social gatherings, the way she name-dropped connections, the way she'd react with cold fury to any perceived slight or challenge to her authority. Gertrude's arraignment was set for the following week. She'd been released on $1 million bail, posted immediately by her attorney, a shark named Brendan Ramos who specialized in defending wealthy clients. Grant attended the hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom while Ramos argued that his client was a pillar of the community, a devoted grandmother who'd suffered a mental break brought on by grief over her late husband and concern for her granddaughter's welfare. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Gail McGowan, pushed back hard, detailing the premeditation and the cache of evidence. But Grant could see some of the observers softening as Ramos painted Gertrude as a tragic figure. When Gertrude entered the courtroom, she looked nothing like the steel-spined woman who'd swept into his home with poisoned cookies. She appeared frail, elderly, wearing a simple dress instead of her power suits. Her silver hair hung loose around her shoulders. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. It was a performance, and Grant recognized it for what it was. But it would work on some people. It always did. After the hearing, Grant was approached by a man in his late 50s wearing an expensive suit and an expression of controlled anger. He introduced himself as Ted Holmes, CEO of a commercial development firm. I knew Gertrude professionally, Ted said. We served on the architectural review board together. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what she did to your family, and I hope they throw the book at her." Grant studied the man, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched. "You don't sound like someone who just knew her professionally." Ted glanced around, then lowered his voice. 15 years ago, Gertrude and I were in competition for a prime development site in River North. She won the bid through what I later discovered were falsified inspection reports and bribes to city officials. I had proof, but by the time I could act, she'd sold the property at triple the price and buried the evidence. Cost me millions and nearly destroyed my company. Why tell me this? Because I've been waiting a long time to see Gertrude Murphy get what she deserves. And because if you're looking for leverage. Ted handed Grant a business card. "I have files. Documentation I could never use in court because the statute of limitations expired. But if you wanted to damage her reputation, show the world who she really is." Grant pocketed the card. "I'll be in touch." That night, Grant sat down with the files Ted had emailed. They detailed a pattern of corruption, intimidation, and fraud spanning decades. Gertrude had built her empire on the suffering of others. Small business owners forced out, contractors cheated, regulations bypassed. And she'd gotten away with it all through careful legal maneuvering and strategic donations to the right political campaigns. The more Grant read, the clearer his path became. Gertrude valued three things above all else: wealth, reputation, and control. The criminal trial would threaten her freedom, but Grant was going to systematically dismantle everything else. He started with quiet phone calls. Ted Holmes connected him with others who'd been burned by Gertrude. A contractor named Alan Burke who'd been blacklisted after refusing to use substandard materials. A former business partner named Hannah Sheridan who'd been forced out of a lucrative deal through manufactured accusations. A nonprofit director named Peggy Rosales who'd watched promised donations evaporate when she wouldn't support one of Gertrude's pet projects. Each person had a story. Each one had been powerless against Gertrude's wealth and influence. But together, they represented a pattern. Grant began assembling a comprehensive dossier, cross-referencing public records with the private testimonies. He worked late into the nights while Melinda slept fitfully and Emma had nightmares about cookies that turned into monsters. 3 weeks after the arrest, Grant made his first move. He contacted Angelo Roman, an investigative journalist with the Chicago Tribune known for his exposés on corruption and white-collar crime. They met at a coffee shop in Hyde Park, far from Grant's usual haunts. Angelo was in his 40s, with tired eyes and the rumpled appearance of someone who'd spent too many nights chasing leads. "I've been following the Gertrude Murphy case," Angelo said after Grant explained why they were meeting. "Attempted poisoning of her own granddaughter. It's horrific. It's also just the latest crime in a 30-year pattern." Grant slid a USB drive across the table. "Everything on here is documented, verified, with witnesses willing to go on record." Angelo examined the drive. "Why come to me? The prosecutor already has her dead to rights on the poisoning charge." "Because prison isn't enough. Gertrude Murphy built her life on a facade of respectability. She poisoned my daughter, but she's poisoned this city for decades, through corruption, fraud, and exploitation. I want everyone to know who she really is." Angelo's expression shifted from skeptical to interested. "You want to destroy her legacy. I want the truth exposed. What happens to her legacy is just a consequence." Over the following month, while the legal machinery ground toward trial, Angelo's investigation unfolded like a masterclass in journalism. He started with small articles, profiles of people Gertrude had wronged, analyses of suspicious property deals, examinations of her charitable foundation's finances. Each article cited sources, included documentation, and followed every ethical guideline. There was nothing Gertrude's lawyers could do to stop it because everything Angelo published was true. The effect was cumulative and devastating. Board positions that had seemed secure began to wobble as organizations distanced themselves from the mounting scandal. Northwestern Memorial quietly removed her name from the hospital wing, returning her donation and citing changed circumstances. The Architectural Review Board accepted her resignation. But Grant wasn't done. His second move targeted Gertrude's financial empire directly. Through his network of engineers and developers, Grant had learned that several of Gertrude's commercial properties had code violations that had been overlooked for years through her connections with city inspectors. Armed with Ted Holmes's documentation and his own professional knowledge, Grant filed formal complaints with the Department of Buildings, triggering mandatory inspections. The inspections revealed what Grant had suspected: serious structural issues, safety hazards, violations that would require expensive remediation. Properties that had been generating steady rental income suddenly faced closure orders until repairs were completed. Gertrude's income stream began to dry up. Her legal fees, meanwhile, were mounting. Brendan Ramos didn't come cheap, and the complexity of the case was only increasing as prosecutors added charges based on the arsenic purchase records and premeditation evidence. Grant watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. But the most important phase of his plan was still ahead. He'd been studying Gertrude's trial strategy through contacts with the prosecutor's office. Ramos was planning to argue diminished capacity, that Gertrude had suffered a psychotic break brought on by unprocessed grief over her husband's death and an irrational fear that Emma was in danger. The defense would paint her as a tragic figure, a grandmother who'd loved too much and lost her way. They'd bring in expert witnesses, psychiatrists who'd testify to her mental state. They'd emphasize her age, her previously clean record, her community contributions. It was a strategy that might work, especially with the right jury. Grant couldn't let that happen. He needed Gertrude to condemn herself, and he knew exactly how to make that happen. The key to Gertrude's personality, Grant had learned over 9 years of marriage, was her absolute conviction in her own righteousness. She never believed she was wrong, only that others were too limited to understand her vision. Even now, facing criminal charges, she would see herself as the victim of misunderstanding. That certainty was her weakness, and Grant was going to exploit it. Through Melinda's cousin Tabitha, who'd been horrified by her aunt's actions but maintained nominal contact, Grant learned that Gertrude was writing a memoir while out on bail. She was documenting her version of events, her justifications, her perspective on how she'd only been trying to protect Emma from a mediocre life with unsuitable parents. Gertrude couldn't help herself. She had to be understood, had to explain, had to prove she'd been right all along. Grant arranged for Tabitha to accidentally mention to Gertrude that a major publisher was interested in true crime stories from the inside. The publisher was real enough, a small press that specialized in controversial narratives. What Gertrude didn't know was that the acquisition editor Grant had her dealing with was actually Lon Kirby, one of Ted Holmes's employees with a background in corporate intelligence. Lon encouraged Gertrude's writing, asked probing questions, got her to elaborate on her planning, her reasoning, her view of Grant and Melinda as negligent parents. Every conversation was recorded. Every email was saved. Meanwhile, Grant worked a parallel track through Emma's therapist. Dr. Marla Houston had been seeing Emma twice a week to help her process the trauma of learning her grandmother had tried to poison her. With Grant and Melinda's permission, Dr. Houston documented Emma's healing process, including statements Emma made about Gertrude's behavior leading up to the poisoning attempt. Emma talked about how grandmother had always made her feel special, but also different from other kids. How grandmother said Emma was too good for public school, for their neighborhood, for the life her parents provided. How grandmother had told her the cookies were a special medicine that would make her strong and smart like grandmother herself. The prosecution added this evidence to their case. But more importantly, Dr. Houston, with the family's consent, prepared a victim impact statement that would be read at sentencing. It was Emma's voice, captured in heartbreaking clarity, describing how she trusted her grandmother and felt betrayed. As the trial date approached, Grant implemented the final phase of his plan. He'd been monitoring Gertrude's remaining business interests through public records, and he'd noticed something interesting. Her flagship property, a historic building in the Loop that housed upscale retail and offices, was mortgaged to the hilt. She'd been using it as collateral for years, refinancing repeatedly to fund her lifestyle and legal fees. Grant had a friend from college, Tyrone Kerr, who worked in commercial real estate investment. Through Tyrone, Grant connected with several investors who were interested in distressed properties. He fed them information about the building's financial instability, the mounting code violations at Gertrude's other properties, her legal troubles. The investors began making inquiries, which spooked Gertrude's lenders. Banks didn't like uncertainty, especially when their collateral was connected to someone facing criminal charges and a publicity nightmare. 2 months before trial, the bank called Gertrude's loan. She had 90 days to pay the full balance or face foreclosure. She couldn't pay. Her other properties were tied up in remediation and couldn't be sold quickly. Her legal fees had drained her liquid assets. The charitable foundation she'd controlled had severed ties. Gertrude Murphy, who'd built an empire on power and control, was watching it crumble in real time. Grant knew about the foreclosure before it was public because Tyrone called him. The building's going to auction next month. You interested? Not personally, Grant said. But I know some people who might be. He connected Tyrone with Alan Burke, the contractor Gertrude had blacklisted, and Hannah Sheridan, the former business partner she'd forced out. Together, they formed a limited partnership and placed a bid. They won the auction at 70 cents on the dollar. Gertrude's crown jewel, the building she'd pointed to as proof of her business acumen, now belonged to people she'd wronged. The symbolism wasn't lost on the press. Angelo Roman covered it in his ongoing series, tying it to the larger story of Gertrude's fall from grace. The trial began on a gray Monday in October. The courtroom was packed. Media, curious onlookers, some of Gertrude's former society friends attending more from morbid fascination than support. Grant sat in the front row every single day, Emma and Melinda beside him when the testimony wasn't too graphic. He watched as prosecutor Gail McGowan systematically built her case. The arsenic purchase, the recipe with dosage calculations, the emails about custody, the journal entries planning the poisoning, the expert testimony about the compound's effects. Gertrude's defense was exactly what Grant had anticipated. Brendan Ramos called psychiatrists who testified about late-onset mental illness, about grief-induced psychosis, about a grandmother's love twisted into something tragic. He emphasized her age, her previously unblemished record, her charitable work. He tried to paint Grant as a vindictive son-in-law who'd poisoned the relationship between grandmother and grandchild through jealousy and control. Grant endured it all with calm composure, because he knew what was coming. When it was his turn to testify, Grant spoke clearly and factually. He described the family dynamics, Gertrude's controlling behavior, the cookie's arrival, the discovery at his office. He remained measured even when Ramos tried to rattle him during cross-examination. Isn't it true you resented my client's success? Ramos demanded. No, Grant said simply. I resented her attempts to undermine my marriage and control my daughter's life. Success has nothing to do with it. You've orchestrated a campaign to destroy her reputation, haven't you? I've cooperated with journalists investigating her business practices. I've filed legitimate complaints about code violations. I've exercised my legal rights. Just as she exercised what she believed were her rights when she put arsenic in cookies meant for my daughter. The jury leaned forward, engaged. Grant had their attention. Melinda's testimony was harder to watch. She spoke through tears about her mother's betrayal, about the guilt she felt for not seeing the warning signs, about the damage to her relationship with Emma. My mother taught me that love meant control, Melinda said. That if you really cared about someone, you made their decisions for them. I spent my whole life trying to earn her approval, and I never realized that she didn't actually want me to succeed. She wanted me dependent. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source, Gertrude herself. Ramos had advised against it, but Gertrude insisted. She needed to explain herself, to make the jury understand. It was her fundamental nature, the same compulsion that had led her to write the memoir, to document her planning, to believe she could justify the unjustifiable. She took the stand in a conservative dress, her silver hair styled, her posture erect, and she proceeded to bury herself. I only wanted what was best for Emma, she began, and it went downhill from there. She talked about Grant's mediocre career, Melinda's failure to maximize her potential, Emma's wasted opportunities. She described her calculations, how much arsenic would make Emma sick but not fatally ill, how she'd planned to document the symptoms, how she'd arranged for expert medical testimony about environmental toxins in their neighborhood. I was going to save her, Gertrude said, and she actually sounded sincere. Give her the life she deserved, with opportunities, with culture, with excellence. Prosecutor McGowan barely had to cross-examine. She just let Gertrude talk, rope out, hang herself. You're saying you deliberately poisoned your granddaughter? I was administering a controlled dosage to create symptoms that would justify intervention. You purchased industrial arsenic and baked it into cookies. I used a precisely calculated amount. That could have killed her. No, I was very careful. I'm not a monster. The courtroom was silent except for someone in the back row gasping. Grant watched the jury's faces. They'd gone from skeptical to horrified to disgusted. Gertrude couldn't see it. She was still talking, still explaining, still convinced she could make them understand. When Ramos finally got her off the stand, cutting her testimony short in damage control mode, the harm was done. Gertrude had confessed everything, justified nothing, and revealed herself as exactly what she was. Someone so consumed by the need for control that she'd poisoned a child and called it love. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, child endangerment, criminal conspiracy. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later. In the interim, Gertrude remained out on bail, but her world had fully collapsed. The last of her properties sold at auction to cover legal fees and debts. Her charitable foundation was dissolved amid investigations into fund misappropriation, another gift from Ted Holmes's files. Former friends and colleagues issued statements condemning her actions. She was alone, disgraced, and facing significant prison time. On the day of sentencing, Grant arrived early. He'd prepared his own victim impact statement, though Dr. Houston would be reading Emma's. Melinda was beside him, thinner than she'd been months ago but stronger in ways that mattered. The courtroom filled. Gertrude entered with Ramos, looking diminished in her orange jumpsuit, no longer able to maintain the facade of respectability. Judge Jeffrey Moyer, no relation to Gertrude despite the shared first name, was known as a fair but firm jurist. He'd presided over the trial with patience and precision, and Grant had watched him carefully throughout. Dr. Houston read Emma's statement first. It was simple, heartbreaking. "I love my grandmother. I thought she loved me too. But she hurt me in a way I don't understand. She made me afraid of cookies and afraid of people who say they love me. I don't know if I'll ever trust like that again. I'm only 7, but I know that what she did was wrong. And I know I'm safe now because my daddy protected me." Grant's eyes burned. Melinda gripped his hand. Then Grant read his own statement. He spoke about trust betrayed, about the violation of the most fundamental bonds of family, about the calculus of evil masquerading as love. He talked about Emma's nightmares, Melinda's therapy, his own struggle to understand how someone could commit such an act. Gertrude Murphy didn't lose her mind, Grant concluded. She revealed who she'd always been, someone for whom other people exist only as extensions of her will. My daughter wasn't a person to her. She was a possession to be controlled. And when that control was threatened, Gertrude chose to destroy rather than accept. That's not mental illness. That's moral bankruptcy. And it deserves the maximum consequence the law allows. Other impact statements followed, from Tabitha, from Emma's teacher, from neighbors who'd watched the family struggle. Even Ted Holmes submitted a written statement detailing the decades of harm Gertrude had caused beyond this single criminal act. Finally, Judge Moyer spoke. "Mrs. Murphy, you've been convicted of attempting to murder your granddaughter through deliberate, calculated poisoning. The evidence was overwhelming. Your own testimony confirmed your guilt. But what makes this case particularly egregious is your continued insistence that your actions were justified, that you were somehow the victim or the hero of this situation. You've shown no remorse, no recognition of the profound harm you've caused, no acceptance of responsibility. You've demonstrated a complete inability to see your granddaughter as anything other than an object to be controlled. The law allows me discretion in sentencing. I've reviewed the psychiatric evaluations. I've considered your age and lack of prior criminal record. I've noted the defense's arguments for leniency. I find them unconvincing. You planned this crime over months. You researched dosages. You manufactured opportunities. You attempted to manipulate the legal system to gain custody of a child you were actively poisoning. This wasn't a momentary lapse or a grief-induced breakdown. This was sustained, deliberate, calculating malice. I sentence you to 25 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Additionally, you are permanently enjoined from any contact with the victim or her immediate family. This includes all written, electronic, or third-party communication. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. 25 years for a 63-year-old woman meant likely dying in prison. Gertrude's composure finally cracked. She turned in her seat, searching the courtroom, and her eyes locked on Grant. For a moment, he saw pure hatred there, rage at being thwarted, fury at losing control, resentment at being held accountable. Then the bailiffs were escorting her out, and she was gone. Grant felt Melinda sag against him in relief. Around them, people were talking, reporters were scribbling, supporters were offering congratulations. But Grant just sat quietly, feeling the weight of the past months settle and then lift. It was over. Emma was safe. Gertrude would spend the rest of her life understanding what it meant to be powerless. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Grant made a brief statement, thanking the prosecutors, the police, the witnesses who'd come forward. He didn't mention his own role in exposing Gertrude's broader corruption, didn't take credit for the financial and reputational destruction he'd orchestrated. That wasn't the point. The point was that Gertrude Murphy had come for his family, and he'd made sure she'd paid for it in every way that mattered. 6 months later, Grant stood in Emma's new bedroom. Not a new house, but a redecorated space with fresh paint and new furniture she'd chosen herself. The nightmares had decreased. The therapy was working. Emma was laughing more, trusting more, being a kid again. Melinda had filed for a legal name change, dropping Murphy and reclaiming her maiden name from her father's side. She'd also started her own marketing consultancy, stepping out from under the shadow of trying to live up to Gertrude's expectations. Their marriage was stronger than it had been in years. The crisis had burned away a lot of pretense and revealed what mattered. Grant himself had been promoted at Morrison & Associates, his handling of the situation earning respect from colleagues who'd watched him navigate personal hell while maintaining professional excellence. The Riverside project had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget, with affordable housing units already changing lives. He'd also quietly established a foundation using money from the settlement of a civil suit against Gertrude's estate. The foundation provided legal assistance to victims of elder abuse and exploitation, particularly cases involving affluent perpetrators who'd previously escaped accountability. Angelo Roman's investigative series had won awards and led to reforms in how the city handled building code enforcement and political donations. Ted Holmes and the others who'd helped Grant had seen their own reputations rehabilitated as the full story of Gertrude's corruption emerged. As for Gertrude herself, she was in Decatur Correctional Center, a medium-security women's prison downstate. Grant had heard through the legal grapevine that she'd struggled with the adjustment, the loss of control, the institutional hierarchy, the forced equality with people she'd always considered beneath her. She'd tried to file appeals, but they'd been denied. Her lawyers had abandoned her when the money ran out. She was alone with the consequences of her choices. Grant didn't feel guilty about that. He'd protected his family and ensured that someone who'd caused decades of harm finally faced justice. The system had worked, yes, but only because he'd made sure it had all the tools it needed. Sometimes people asked him if he felt like he'd gone too far, orchestrating Gertrude's financial and social destruction beyond the criminal prosecution. He always gave the same answer. I didn't destroy Gertrude Murphy. I just made sure everyone could see who she really was. The destruction was already there. I just exposed it. On a Saturday morning in early spring, Grant took Emma to the park. She ran ahead to the swings, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Melinda was beside him, their hands linked. Do you think she'll ever ask about Gertrude again? Melinda wondered. Probably. When she's older, she'll have questions. What will you tell her? Grant watched his daughter soar higher on the swing, fearless and free. The truth. That someone who was supposed to love her tried to hurt her. That we protected her. That justice was served. And that she's safe now. That's all. That's everything. Emma jumped from the swing at the ark's peak, landed in the mulch, and came running back to them, grinning and grass-stained and perfectly, wonderfully alive. Grant caught her in his arms and held her close. This child who'd been targeted by someone's twisted version of love and had survived because her father refused to let evil win. Gertrude had wanted to control Emma's future, to shape her into some idealized version. Instead, she'd lost everything while Emma gained something more valuable. Parents who'd proven they'd move heaven and earth to keep her safe. That was the real victory. Not the prison sentence, or the financial ruin, or the public disgrace. The victory was Emma's laughter, Melinda's healing, their family's future unburdened by Gertrude's poison. Grant had learned he was capable of calculated revenge, of strategic destruction, of cold fury in defense of those he loved. Those weren't qualities he'd thought he possessed, but he'd also learned he was capable of surviving hell and building something better on the other side. And as he walked back to the car with his wife and daughter, Grant Reeves knew with absolute certainty that he'd do it all again if he had to. Because that's what you did when someone came for your family. You protected them. You fought back. And you made damn sure the people who tried to hurt them understood exactly what they'd lost. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.